One of the most influential books of the later European Middle Ages is one that really nobody reads anymore, and arguably few people read at the time. The Art of Courtly Love, or De Amore, in the original, is written by Andreas Capellanus, who was we don't really care about him. He was attached to a royal court. This was the royal court of, I believe, Marie de Champagne in France. This was a kind of secular Bible for courtly life. It is an opportunity to lay out for anyone who cares to observe it the rules and traditions governing behavior. And it is in many ways a book about how to conduct oneself among the opposite sex. Primarily it is written for men interacting with women, and this was significantly a product of a royal court, so it's already like telling you exactly what demographic it's shooting for there. So it's not common men and common women, but rather gentlemen and ladies who are laying around in the royal court there for the entertainment, essentially, of whatever monarch is present. And it is significantly also a product for a female royal court. This is This is for someone who is attached to the royal court of Marie de Champagne. So it is. It's got gender complications woven throughout its entire foundation. And the book itself is an interesting meditation on the nature of love, and it lays out in many different forms. Some just frankly, theological. Some of them just simple essays, as they would come to be known. Some are laid out in dialogue form, an inheritance from, let's say, the Greek tradition, perhaps, like Plato. And perhaps the most significant chunk of it comes in the form of a simple list, which we'll get to. It is, at times, a quite pedantic work. It is, at times, quite boring. But it lays out, or it seeks to lay out, a blueprint for behavior. And in that, you can see how writers drawing from this, and Andreas Capellanus, Andreas the chaplain, the monk essentially, is drawing from a literary tradition and trying to describe like, well, okay, this is what's going on. Certain, knights, the knightly tradition of literature certainly predates him, but he is trying to draw from that and distill into it a kind of rule book. And it is from Capellanus, then, Andreas Capellanus, that later writers will start to draw their influence. So they're drawing from the literary tradition of the imaginative literary tradition, let's say, and also from Capellanus's characterization of it. And so it really goes a long way, this fairly obscure work, it goes a long way to shape what would become known in the late Middle Ages as the chivalric code, the tradition of chivalrous behavior, particularly towards women, but not exclusively. But how should a proper knight, or to extrapolate, how should a proper gentleman behave? And in that way, it has had a remarkable legacy of influence in the arts, in history, quite frankly, in simple behaviors. You can read an awful lot of this, and it's like an introduction into, quite frankly, diplomacy. If you can master Capellanus, you are probably fit to go work in any embassy in the world and behave yourself appropriately, because it is all about meeting people on similar levels, but with different intricate patterns of rules among them, and negotiating all of those sometimes uncomfortable fault lines that run through human interaction. Sociability is filled with pitfalls, and we all succumb to them from time to time. Andreas the chaplain, is trying to give you a bit of a guidepost, and his perspective is really pretty clear of what he's trying to do. It begins. Again, reading the whole thing is really kind of a hard slog sometimes, although it's really not very long. But certain things jump out, and you can just flip through it, and honestly, it's a great book to crack open at any time. Just sort of like, whoa, what is that? Love is a certain inborn suffering derived from the sight and of the excessive meditation upon the beauty of the opposite sex, which causes each one to wish above all things the embraces of the other, and by common desire to carry out all of love's precepts in the other's embrace. That's chapter 1. That's the beginning of chapter 1. And it is quite frank in what it's saying. Love is a certain inborn suffering. There's a lot right there. Love is inborn, first of all. It is natural. It is very interior. And when something is interior, it implies that there's a little bit of a division, perhaps, between what is within and what is shown. Appearance and reality are always fractured, let's say, between them. And that is very medieval in the European tradition, that you must try and see through the appearance of something, see through the reality or the superficial qualities to the reality underneath. This is the hallmark of medieval European art. And it is also not only inborn and natural, it is suffering. Love is suffering. And here is born every Hollywood cheesy rom-com ever. Love is suffering, because it's not about just acting on natural impulses and, okay, this is very natural. It is about the suffering. And by characterizing it like that and just picking that out, certainly he's not inventing the idea of the frustrations of romantic love. But he is highlighting that this is somehow the way it's supposed to be, and that this is somehow ennobling, and he'll get to that. But it is suffering, and it's inborn. And the idea is that it is supposed to be, suffering is natural, it's supposed to be accepted, it is supposed to be hidden within. You're not supposed to necessarily show it, but it is the central motivating reality of human social behavior in this book. Excessive derived from the sight and excessive meditation upon the beauty of the opposite sex. Leave the whole opposite sex heteronormative stuff aside. But it is derived from the sight and excessive meditation upon the beauty. That has nothing to do with getting to know someone. According to this definition, you can be head over heels in love with someone whom you've never met, never spoken to, know absolutely nothing about. You can fall in love with a picture of someone, an idea of someone, and thus Hollywood rom-coms, to be perfectly honest. But it's an idea. It is, again, a sort of a distance. You're falling in love with a superficial image, not what's going on underneath. So automatically you can say, well, is this really love? Well, okay, to the courtly tradition, it is, because it is not supposed to be necessarily two hearts and minds meeting and completing, as certain Platonic traditions would have it, quite honestly. But it is supposed to be a sense of objectification, that the beloved, the subject of love, is or the object of love, rather. The object of love, I'll get there. The object of love is somehow quite alien, somehow quite objectified, and there is a often unbridgeable chasm between the subject and the object, which causes each one to wish above all things the embraces of the other, and by common desire to carry out all of love's precepts in the other's embrace. Again, doesn't say that it is ever consummated. Doesn't say that they actually have to touch. It is about the wish above all things. It's about the desire. It's about the ambition. It's about seeing the goal and focusing on it and staying true to it without ever actually being able to attain it. And this is the chivalric tradition of love. This is the sacred quality of it. Because Andreas Capellanus, the chaplain, is above all a religious man, I think you could say. Well, not above all. But he is casting the idea of love over within a religious frame, a specifically Christian religious frame, where the object of love is unattainable. It is an ideal to which you owe maximum fealty, but you'll never get anywhere. Perhaps after death, which is cold comfort for, lonely high schoolers. It's just brutal. But again, it's that impulse to achieve or reach something ideal, something distant, something always just out of reach. Desire. For when a man sees some woman fit for love and shaped according to his taste, he begins at once to lust after her in his heart. Then the more he thinks about her, the more he burns with love, until he comes to a fuller meditation. The ideal, the unbridgeable quality of it, the ultimate mystery of it, the alien quality of it, that it is unknowable. And the burning with lust can be taken a couple of different ways, and it will be taken a couple of different ways. That is not necessarily a sexual lust. And some people will say that, well, really it's just a passion, let's say, for the ideal. You can have a passion for divinity, let's say, that is not necessarily located or originated in the same locus as lust, but that sense is there. The It is primarily at first quite superficial, and it is driven by passion, desire, in some cases, yes, lust. Uh, the more he thinks about it, the more he burns with love. So again, there's more suffering. It's not saying the more he goes up and gets to know the person. It's saying no. The more he dwells on it, the more he thinks about it. Love in the medieval frame is very much an intellectual and idealized activity. Presently, he begins to think about the fashioning of the women and to differentiate her limbs, to think about what she does, to pry into her secrets of her body, and he desires to put each part of it to the fullest use. And this is pure objectification. He begins to essentially dissect her in his mind into different parts, different physical parts, and you can go crazy with the idea of the objectification of women here, but it is about a lover's objectification of somebody that he or she idealizes. And I'm going to go back and forth between the he and she thing, but it's primarily written for the behavior of men towards women. Then, after he has come to complete meditation, love cannot hold the reins, but he proceeds at one to action. Straightway he strives to get a helper and to find an intermediary. So here he's laying out, okay, you've become infatuated. This is what you do. You need a helper, you need an intermediary. And then he's going to lay out the steps that it takes to pursue this love. Not necessarily to achieve it, but to pursue it. And it's all about the pursuit. And here again, you can see the Christian aspects of it that are not hard to spot. And he lays out different rules very clearly and different methods for achieving and how you're supposed to pursue women in different contexts and how different people are supposed to go about these things. And he goes through it in a very hierarchical, class-based sense. The pursuit of women, where the woman outranks in the social hierarchy, where the women outranks the men, where the men outrank the women, where how many stations can you jump in doing these things? How many when is it considered absolutely verboten to go beneath that station? All of these very intricate rules for how to conduct yourself in a very hierarchical courtly society. And here you can see the background. These are all knights doing this. Knights are also known as earls. They are within a royal pecking order, so you speak, with the king and the queen at the top, and then beneath that it goes down into very different and extraordinarily structured levels. It is a very rigid stratification of society, and there was no such thing as social mobility. You could not necessarily break out of it. And here's where you really sort of steer away from the Hollywood tradition, where the poor girl goes and gets the wealthy hot guy, and their love conquers all across class differences. That doesn't happen here. This is very much about how to operate within this very structured system. And they deal with all the different levels. Capellanus, Andreas Capellanus, full name is the only name we have for him is Andreas, essentially. And Capellanus is his title. But again, I'm going to mix that up. He focuses on all of these different things because this is what his readership is interested in. He's not writing this for general consumption. This is way before the printing press. This is way before most people could read. He is writing this for that narrow group of people who are sitting around him at any particular time in the day. And they are other members of the aristocracy on this highly rigid stratification. He has no interest really in speaking to anybody else. This is for that audience, and they just want to know the rules for how to get along, because you got to think of it from their perspective. Particularly during the winter months, when it's cold and nasty out, there's not a lot for a knight to do. A knight's primary job is to go out and fight for his monarch, for his liege. But there are big chunks of the year where that's just not really all that practical. It's difficult to go and fight in the winter time. So you got a lot of time to lay around. So you get a disproportionate number of literary works coming out of the Middle Ages that deal with the holidays. Christmas starts to become a thing in the medieval era, because you got all these people just sort of laying around with nothing to do. So, you take a bunch of very physical people, fighters, who are used to conquering, let's say, and you give them a whole lot of free time and, let them sit around and eat and drink an awful lot throughout the day, and they're gonna start to interact, shall we say, with the ladies present. And this can, in a small society, create some frustrations, some tensions, let's say. And this book, this little rule book, helps lay that out a little bit. It tamps down some of the potential conflicts that can happen by saying, okay, this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you're not allowed to do, this is how you would go about it, and above all, always trying to nudge the impulses, the natural sexual, social impulses that people may have, and cast them into a more idealized, polite, and religious frame. Always trying to nudge them towards, just be better. Just, let's not just give in to the basest human instincts here. Let's try and refine it. We are all the aristocracy, the best by definition. So let's try and act that way. Because if you just, if you turn the winter months into just a 3-month orgy of brawling and rape, it's going to be unpleasant. So this book starts to lay out some of the particulars, and they are fun to read. Just to give an idea of, like, the different stations within the culture, within the very narrow, cloistered, in some cases literally, cohort of people. One of my particular favorites, and you don't really need to know any of this, but it is fun to go up, he has a chapter on the love of the clergy for priests. This is medieval France. This is, the priesthood is exclusively a Catholic thing, and they are supposed to be celibate by tradition, by Vatican fiat at this point. And the writer, who is himself a member of the clergy, writes, oh, well, this, not supposed to do this. This would be bad. The clergy are not supposed to be involved in romance at any time. And then at the very end of this very short chapter, he offers this little caveat, or, aside. But since hardly anyone ever lives without carnal sin, and since the life of the clergy is, because of the continual idleness and great abundance of food, naturally more liable to temptations of the body than that of any other man, where you can see Andreas the chaplain sort of saying, well, okay, because of our, because of the life we lead, it's where the temptations are even stronger upon us. of any other men. If that clerk wishes to enter into the lists of love, let him speak and apply himself to love service in accordance with the rank or standing of his parents, as we have already fully explained in regard to the different ranks of men. Which is a little bit of a catch-22, but it does allow an out. It's saying, if a priest or any member of the clergy who is supposed to be celibate should want to, he should do so very formally and forthrightly. Enter the lists of love, like he's signing up for a tournament. Which sounds preposterous. But it does make that subtle argument within there saying, well, because the temptations are so much stronger for us, and it's, the pressure is so much harder on us, and we have women coming up to us, bearing their souls to us every day. Hey, you can see. Now, this doesn't say, it says very explicitly that if you want to, just declare it publicly and take the consequences from there. Consequences might very well be that you get kicked out of the priesthood or not. But it is all about making this very public declaration and being very forthright about it, when everybody knows that the reality is not in the superficial image of it, but the reality is underneath, and it is very different from the public face. But he's creating that little wiggle room there, I would say, to open up the idea of, well, behind closed doors, who could blame you? Nuns, he follows that up with a chapter on the love of nuns, and he's much more censorious here. Even love's commandment warns us not to choose for our love any woman whom we may not properly seek to marry. Marriage is not really what it's supposed to be here. And if anyone should think so little of himself and of both laws as to seek for the love of a nun, he would deserve to be despised by everyone and ought to be avoided as an abominable beast. And there's a fair amount of flat-out misogyny coming up there, because, well, everybody knows it's okay for priests to get a little something on the side, but nuns, oh my God, no. He takes the side of the priests, or the perspective of the priests, at that one famous last caveat where, he says, well, since we have so much idleness and we have all of the, we're so well fed, it's so much harder on us. That's taking the priest's side, but he does not extend that same courtesy to the nuns. The nuns are horrible, and cavorting with them, let's say, would be an abomination. It's misogyny. But there's very little about this book that doesn't have a misogynist undertone available for whoever seeks it. Sometimes it clubs you over the head. Sometimes it's just a little bit more subtle. The capstone of the book. It ends essentially on a high note. Well, it's broken up into 3 parts. Book 1, Book 2, Book 3. Most of the arguing goes on in Book 1 and the first part of Book 2. Book 2 ends very significantly with a list of 31 rules for how to behave. And I gotta love that, he makes everybody wade through his arguments and, playing out different scenarios. And then he just cuts to the chase and says, okay, now for all of you who don't want to parse all my little parables, who don't want to sit there and, just dig through the intricate meanings I am laying out for you, for those of you without the literary training that perhaps I have, I'm just going to spell them out for you. And you can picture, like, your average knights who, again, are laying around. They're paid to fight. They're probably not, geniuses. And especially if they're laying around all day just drinking, quite frankly, they're not going to be able to sit there and ruminate on the themes within his little stories or something like that. But simple numbered rules everybody loves. Step by step, it's perfect. Some of them are really quite explicit. Marriage is no real excuse for not loving. That's number one. And here is significant. Marriage is not the same thing as love, and quite honestly, they are usually antithetical. Marriage, in the traditional sense, is really more of an economic arrangement. It tends to be, at least among the aristocracy that we're dealing with here, it tends to be about continuing bloodlines, about creating alliances with other monarchs, other houses, other aristocracies, so that you're not constantly at war. Give me, we've been fighting for 10 years. Why don't you just give me your daughter to marry, and we'll call a truce, because then I'll have something of yours. You'll be resistant to attack me, because that would mean attacking your daughter or whatever. And you can see that. So marriage was very frequently an involuntary arrangement among its principals, and just doing it for economic or political reasons. Nothing to do with love. Doesn't come into the picture at all. Marriage is no excuse for not loving. So here it's telling you that, well, if you want to be in love, look for it outside marriage. Extramarital love. That's pretty much the only love that they're talking about here, because those knights laying around, some of the women that they would be serving in this courtesy or this chivalric tradition, some of them might be single. A vast number of them will be married. Some of them will be married to their boss, the king or the prince or whatever court they're in. The top guy. It's not an infrequent situation where the top guy is going to be significantly older than the younger wife. Middle-aged guys today are not inventing this. The top guy has lived a long time. He has gotten to where he is, social mobility rules aside, by being around long enough to club other people into submission. So he is very often a little advanced in years. And the girls that he gets to marry, after he's done all of his fighting and he wants to come home and say, well, okay, it's time to start kicking out the kids so that I have an heir. And he's not going to look for someone his own age at that point. He's going to look for someone young. The average marriage age was usually right around when teenage girls become physically able to become pregnant. So we're talking about like 12 or 13 years old very frequently. So there's a significant age gap between them. So, okay, they're not going to have a lot of the same interests. The young girl might be perhaps more energetic than the middle-aged guy who's been beat up an awful lot in his life. That is automatically a dynamic. And all of the knights are necessarily younger guys too. So they're young and they're lusty and they're looking around and they see a bored queen over there. She's frustrated, dealing with an old husband who doesn't really pay any attention to her, and they have nothing in common. and perhaps her husband killed her grandfather or something, and these battles go on forever. So this mechanism of love is a way of functioning within that society and keeping it orderly. The knight is not supposed to attack the king. The knight is not supposed to overthrow the king so that he can get the girl. The knight is supposed to worship the girl from afar as an ideal. No harm, no foul. It keeps everybody in line. It keeps everybody subservient. It keeps everybody going along with the way things are. Status quo is all they really care about. He who is not jealous cannot love. Jealousy. You're jealous. As a knight, you would be jealous of everybody else who gets attention that you want. And again, that's sort of a little baked-in resentment into it that fuels the ambition. It's a very obvious recognition of negative, the negative instincts in human nature that need to be channeled again into something constructive, into something manageable and polite. No one can be bound by a double love. It is well known that love is always increasing or decreasing. That which a lover takes against his will of his beloved has no relish. So this creates an image of great dynamism within the court life, within the lives of these people who are, again, just laying around all day. No one can be bound by a double love. You can love more than one object, perhaps at the same time. It is well known that love is always increasing or decreasing. So, people are fickle. Yeah, I'm in love with you, and not so much anymore. But this one is so good, well, until she did that. And hey, look at that one. Constantly tumultuous. And that which a lover takes against the will of his beloved has no relish. And here is the female perspective coming in. This is Marie de Champagne coming in and saying, we're all for an active practice of ambition for love, but let's call it off at rape. Let's not go that far. Rape is bad. You are supposed to be spiritual in your practice. You are supposed to be loyal in your ideal of love. And it's not supposed to be rape. It's not supposed to be consummated. It needs to be chaste. And so this sets up the rules whereby you look at medieval literature in the European tradition, and you got a whole lot of knights running around who, might be chasing a grand lady, but it's very infrequent that they consummate that love. It happens, certainly. Famously, Lancelot and Guinevere, with King Arthur watching on, Tristan and Isolde, with King Mark watching on. All of these stories have that little exception, usually when you get up to the higher levels of the hierarchy. But rape is wrong. The physical expression of your love is coarse. Love is meant to be quite idealized, quite intellectualized, objectified again, so that it doesn't necessarily cater to those nastiest of human instincts. The rules lay out a image of a somewhat active but orderly court life. And this is then taken as the example to pursue in all culture that flows from that. And the idea is you're always supposed to be looking up to the ideal as how to pattern your own lives. So you get all of these rules boiled down, evolving slightly, and spreading out into the broader culture. Not necessarily common culture, but certainly as the middle class starts to rise and become a force in culture, it tends to ape and adopt a lot of these notions. So the idea of love being a somewhat suffering, love being an experience of suffering, is automatically adopted in the bourgeois middle class tradition of popular romance and popular culture. And you see this in the art, you see this in the literature, you see this in the evolving form as it comes to be known as the novel, which is primarily at first a very female-centric form, and it tends to involve lovers pining for one another in one capacity or another. It is that suffering. It is that wanting to go there and dealing with all of those obstacles in the way that sometimes cannot be overcome. This is the heritage of the chivalric tradition. Again, there were stories of knights and ladies and Arthurian tradition before this. But once it gets to this stage, once it is crystallized, it gives a kind of force to propel a certain kind of literature, to encapsulate a certain kind of literature, and at the same time to give something that literature and art and culture can react against. Because again and again, you will see great literary figures coming up and considering the knight as a curious example of behavior and how the knight is supposed to react to the world, and how not every facet of the world functions on the same organized principles as the courtly tradition. Knights will come up and they'll have trouble negotiating these things. Sir Gawain, and with the Green Knight, the knights in Chaucer, the figures who arise in Dante in this tradition, all the way up to, let's say, Don Quixote, and how is he supposed to behave? And that whole story is just an articulation of different situations in which he tries to live up to a knightly ideal, and in the then modern perspective of that shows that, well, at times it is quite absurd, but it is also in its way noble, because you are pursuing a kind of ideal. You are pursuing a special notion of humanity as it is available and visible on Earth. And it is that belief that through this behavior, you yourself become better. Love makes you better. Dante in his poetry is and his friends are gonna take this crazy, but the act of love improves you, because it is the act of religious devotion. It channels your energies into a idealized frame. Your natural human, at times quite beastly, animalistic instincts get transformed in the process of love. Love makes you better. In many ways, it's true. Love is if you take the sexuality out of it, love is about creating bonds with other people, about recognizing a shared identity, a shared humanity, a commonality in a often confusing and Byzantine world. Or is that just the way we have been trained to think?